by Jane and Jessica. If you two want to go ahead and introduce yourself. Also, I'm Nina Serrianne. I'm the health. Oh, looks like we're starting over. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're here today to discuss Kavanaugh and his nomination to the Supreme Court and the dangers that his nomination faces for communities of color. My name is Nina Serrianne. I'm the Health Equity Policy Analyst at National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. And I'm joined by Jessica and Jane. If you two want to go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Sure. I'm Jessica Pickney. I'm the Deputy Director of Government Affairs for In Our Own Voice, the National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. We are a national state partnership of Black women's reproductive justice organizations, and our state partners are in California, Texas, Tennessee, Louisiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Georgia.
Hi, I'm Jane Liu. I'm the Legal Director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. We are a national multi-issue organization that advocates for the rights of Asian American and Pacific Islander women and girls. Thanks.
Great, and thanks so much, both of you, for joining us today. So to kick things off, I wanted to chat a little bit about what's at stake for reproductive rights. Should we be worried about access to abortion care with Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court?
I can start. Yeah, I definitely think that we need to be concerned with the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. We know that for many women across the country, particularly communities of color, abortion access has been limited for a long time, despite the fact that Roe v. Wade has been the law of the land since the 70s. But we could see any number of abortion bans come to the Supreme Court under a new Supreme Court, and this would disproportionately impact women of color, many of whom have been systematically denied access to resources and services for decades. And so I think abortion access is definitely under threat with a Kavanaugh nomination or confirmation, and just access to reproductive rights and healthcare overall is threatened.
I totally agree. I mean, I think everyone knows that, Roe is on the table, but I think that what Jessica was pointing out was that it's not just Roe, it's, all the laws that could end up coming before the Supreme Court that restrict abortion access. And that's also a huge danger that, the court decides the constitutionality of a lot of laws related to abortion access. And we need to be really concerned about how, a court that's, imbalanced is going to rule on those kinds of abortion bans, especially given the way that Kavanaugh has ruled in other cases. So.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, we've seen in the beginning of 2018 that 5 states adopted 10 new abortion restrictions. So there's a lot coming down from the states. There are a lot of cases that could very easily make it to the Supreme Court in the next few cycles. And so it's something that we could see fairly quickly also, which I think is important to take into consideration.
We know often that communities of color are facing kind of the brunt of the abortion restrictions that are already in place, and this will only make this worse.
Right.
So on that note, also, I wanted to chat a bit about what's at stake for immigrant rights. What is Kavanaugh's history with women in detention centers, and how will this impact our fight to abolish ICE?
I mean, I think immigrant rights is something that we really need to be concerned about when it comes to Kavanaugh. We have a couple of decisions that he's ruled on that really in which he draws into question whether he believes that immigrants have constitutional and statutory protections under our law. And that's a really scary thing for immigrants to be facing in the courts, that a court that's going to further undermine protections for immigrants. So I think that that's a really big concern. And I think, the Jane Doe cases are a really good indication of how he's going to rubber stamp a lot of what Trump has done on immigration and all of Trump's anti-immigration policies. So in terms of women in detention, obviously in the Jane Doe case, Kavanaugh was ruled against the Jane Doe and was in favor of blocking access for her for an abortion, even though she had literally fulfilled all the requirements to obtain an abortion. He did not see any problem with ORR's policy of restricting abortion access, and that's an indication of not just whether or not there's a real question whether or not he believes that immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, have abortion rights, but also what he thinks about what constitutes a substantial obstacle under the Constitution. And it seems like he's basically saying a lot of obstacles are not substantial obstacles, and that's really scary in terms of thinking about abortion access. So.
Yeah, I mean, I second all that. I think that Kavanaugh's dissent in Garza is just confirmation that the threats to abortion access are really massive, really, at this point. And I also think in some of Kavanaugh's workers' rights cases, his opinions against undocumented individuals in those cases really speaks to what we could see from him as a Supreme Court justice in terms of favoring with employers over employees, particularly those who are undocumented. So I think there are major concerns for communities of color, particularly those in immigrant communities, with a Kavanaugh nomination. And our organizations have done some polling on this, and in Black, AAPI, and Latinx communities, there's a real concern around immigrant justice with a Kavanaugh nomination.
Mm-hmm. Similarly, I wanted us to chat a little bit about what's at stake for the LGBTQ community. I think we've painted a pretty broad picture of how detrimental this nomination or confirmation would be for a lot of communities, but is there anything you want to add for the LGBTQ community?
I mean, I think it's more of the same. We can very easily, it's not a laughing matter, but we could really start to sound like a broken record. I think that Kavanaugh's past history and, something that we really have with Kavanaugh is that there is a huge record of his opinions and dissents on a number of cases that really show the type of judge he is and the conservative opinions that he tends to have. And so I think, we've seen major gains made in terms of marriage equality, but I don't think access, in terms of healthcare is the same for LGBTQ individuals. And they certainly face a lot of discrimination and racism, both in the workplace and in society writ large. And so I think, having seen some of the major decisions that we had this year on the Masterpiece case and other LGBTQ rights cases, this is still a hot button issue that we're likely to see rise to the level of the Supreme Court. And I don't think that anything in Kavanaugh's record indicates that he would be favorable towards LGBTQ individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that. And I think I think when you look at his decisions on, for instance, how he takes a very wide view of whether or not an employer can deny contraceptive coverage on the basis of like religious reasons. I mean, I think those are the kinds of red flags where, I think the LGBTQ community, is really concerned about, whether or not Kavanaugh is going to like broaden those types of exemptions for coverage of certain, benefits and things like that on the basis of religious reasons or moral objections and things like that. And so all of those things, endanger, the access of the LGBT community to like certain workers' protections and benefits. And I think that the issue of, the way that Kavanaugh, his approach to the Constitution is, I think is something that we, like any, community that's been marginalized or targeted, is concerned about, because he takes what he would call a traditional view of the Constitution, which often means that he doesn't recognize or does not believe that certain people groups are protected under the Constitution. And that's really dangerous for communities of color, for LGBTQ folks, and other marginalized communities. So.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things I'm really worried about with what a Kavanaugh confirmation means for the LGBTQ community is, much like how we've seen a hollowing out with Roe, also I'm concerned about a hollowing out of LGBTQ protections. Like you both mentioned, we're anticipating worker protections cases to maybe be going to the Supreme Court, cases that go beyond marriage, equality, and just religious refusals in general. So let's chat about what's at stake for healthcare, what a Kavanaugh confirmation would mean, and how it would impact low-income folks and communities of color with regards to access to healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jane was just touching on some of that, but Kavanaugh has definitely shown that he doesn't support essential healthcare protections, including birth control coverage. So in his dissent in the Priests for Life case, he argued that the ACA's existing accommodation for religious exemptions for contraceptive coverage was a burden on employers' beliefs. And so I think, it's what you were just talking about, Nina, is we're going to see a slow gutting of, access to essential healthcare, including reproductive health care services, but certainly not limited to. And, we know that the Affordable Care Act has been so important for communities of color. I mean, 15 million Black women got coverage through the ACA, and the uninsured rate dropped by 7%. So the ACA is instrumental for women of color writ large, and we have proof in Kavanaugh's dissent that he's not supportive of the ACA.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just going to echo everything that Jessica just said. I mean, I think for the AAPI community as well, the ACA was a huge step forward in expanding coverage, and that's the Asian American community faces many barriers to getting insurance coverage. So like the ACA was such a big step forward for us, and the fact that Kavanaugh has dissented on decisions upholding the ACA is, I think that, there's no question that the ACA is at risk, and we need to be really concerned about access, to health coverage, including reproductive health coverage. But I mean, all services in general are at stake, and I think that that's why there's so much at stake in this SCOTUS fight. It's about our health and our bodies, so.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I know the Latinx community is the most uninsured community in the country, and we've seen incredible gains under the Affordable Care Act. And I think one of my concerns with what a Kavanaugh confirmation would mean in regards to healthcare also is presidential power with his ruling in Seven Sky v. Holder, we saw him both going after the Affordable Care Act, but also presidential power and saying that the president has the law and can ignore the law if they see fit. Which leads me to my next question for what's at stake for our Constitution. I know I just touched on it a little bit, but what are Kavanaugh's views on executive power and how is this dangerous?
I mean, I think that there's, his views as based on his record are that he takes a very wide view of presidential power, and that there's a real concern that, he's kind of going to just rubber stamp, the things that Trump is doing in his office in terms of abusing power. And not just Trump, but also those in his administration that are abusing their power. So I think that that's a really, there's a lot of fear around that. And I think we need to be concerned about, we've set up this system of checks and balances. And if our judiciary is just going to rubber stamp, executive power, then that check is not there anymore. And for communities of color in particular, the judiciary has played such a critical role in protecting our rights. And when there's, a judicial nominee that, has a record of not upholding, constitutional fundamental rights, then we need to be really concerned that, that he also takes a very broad view of executive power as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a ton to add to that. Totally agree. We know that the Supreme Court is going to decide whether we have the power and freedom and opportunity to control our bodies, our lives, ourselves. And I think, it's pretty evident where Judge Kavanaugh stands on executive power. And I think the president has been pretty explicit in his support of that, which is concerning given the amount of horrendous things we're seeing come out of the administration, from the Muslim ban to family separation, so on and so forth. I just think that there's really going to be an onslaught of really important cases, particularly for communities of color, for immigrant communities that come to the Supreme Court over the next couple years. And the president has played a huge role in moving the country in a specific direction. And I think Kavanaugh's views on executive power are going to be really problematic as we look at some of these issues in the coming months and years from a legal perspective.
Mm-hmm. I think you both touched on something that's really important, is how the judiciary really shapes our lives, and reminding folks that this is a lifetime appointment. Mm-hmm. And this is going to shape the Supreme Court for generations to come. So it's not, these fears aren't just immediate, but there's something that we'll be grappling with for decades, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks sometimes feel removed from the conversation around the Supreme Court because we don't necessarily, vote for our Supreme Court justices. And so it's hard to feel engaged in the process. But I think to Nina's point, it's not a short period of time that Supreme Court justices traditionally serve. And, the Supreme Court has had a hand or a say in major civil rights, racial justice cases for decades. And I just think, it's hard to stay on point right now because there are so many issues affecting all of our communities. But this is just like my personal plea that we all stay engaged in the conversations happening around Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court, because to Nina's point, this will impact not just our generation, but generations to come, and could be huge for healthcare, for civil rights, for workers' rights, for immigrants' rights. And these are not easy decisions to overturn. And so I just hope that we'll all stay diligent.
Yeah, and I think that it's, you know, obviously we're really focused on this SCOTUS fight and what's at stake. But I just want to point out that, you know, Trump is not just, you know, targeting the Supreme Court. He's targeting the entire federal judiciary, and the federal judiciary is like literally makes decisions that impact our daily lives all the time, every day. And, you know, while a lot of people are talking about reproductive rights, or like all the issues are on the table, including, you know, the criminal justice is on the issue, you know, is on the table as well, because the judiciary obviously makes, you know, decides criminal cases all the time. And with the Trump administration literally changing the composition of our judiciary, like we really need to be vigilant about like what judges are being nominated and appointed to our federal courts. So.
Absolutely. I want to go back to something Jessica touched on too. I feel like I've been saying a lot that in his record, there's kind of something for everyone, unfortunately, since he does have such a broad record on so many issues. And I think one of the things that's really unsettling and looking at how this would impact the Latinx community is, like, we've already seen in Texas how abortion barriers impact the community, and knowing that we may be seeing this even more extreme on a federal level, but also the Jane Doe case and seeing how his opinions and dissents look at the intersections of gender and immigration and everything else has just been unsettling, I guess is the way to say it. But
and I think, like, just going off on that point, like I think it's important that people remember that, you know, the Jane Doe case it's not just about, you know, it's about reproductive rights, obviously, and abortion access, but it's also about immigrant rights. And those things are like both front and center in that case. And if you, and so it says something, I think his opinion in that case says something about, you know, his views on immigrants, and also says something about his view on reproductive rights. And I want people to like really remember that, because, you know, that's again, like the intersectionality piece is huge here, that that these cases often touch upon, you know, varying people at various intersections, and a lot of his decisions are not evidence, like are reflective of like a lack of consideration of the different circumstances that impact people's lives. And that's hugely concerning for obviously RJ organizations. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to add that we haven't touched on, but I know is something that all of our organizations are thinking about, and that has come up in some of the polling conversations that we've had, is the environment. I think, you know, we've seen some of his decisions in the case of the environment, which are also not necessarily friendly to the opinions that we hold. And I think, you know, communities of color still grapple with having access to clean water and having access to safe environments to raise their families in. And I think that, you know, given the way of the world in 2018, we're also really likely to see some major environmental cases make it to the Supreme Court. And that's huge, because, I mean, thinking about implementing new systems around chemicals or anything like that, like, that's not something that can just be overturned in a day or a night. And so I just thinking, you know, and thinking about communities of color that really do struggle with some of these environmental concerns, I think that's something else that we should keep front of mind when thinking about what a Kavanaugh nomination means.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things we've been talking a lot about his judicial record, but one of the things that I feel like is worth mentioning as well is his time in the Bush White House. And since we haven't been able to see the records and the Senate won't be reviewing his full record before he begins, also having concerns around, if he was behind the Defense of Marriage Act in the Bush White House, if he was behind different abortion restrictions. So although we've been focusing on his judicial record for the purposes of this conversation, just kind of reminding folks that his dangerous ideology goes far beyond just his judicial record, and we've been seeing it for decades.
And that we certainly deserve a fair nomination hearing at the very least, and it doesn't appear as if we're going to get that process.
Yeah. So with all that being said, what can people do about this? How can we take action? How can we stop Kavanaugh?
So, I mean, first and foremost, call your senators, call your senators, call your senators. I know it doesn't feel like it makes a difference, but it really does. And multiple senators have noted that they're keeping counts of the calls that they get. So, while we don't have the ability to vote for a Supreme Court justice, we do have the ability to impact our senators' views on these issues. So call your senator, call them regularly.
Put them on speed dial.
Yes, keep them on speed dial. Make a morning and an evening call. Well, whatever works for your schedule. But just tell them what this nomination means for you, and talk about what a change in the balance of the court could mean for your family and your lived experiences. And I'll let Jane have some time.
I mean, obviously, call your senators. I definitely agree with that, and I think just to give more options about what else you can do. I know sometimes, like Jessica said, it feels kind of like a black hole to calling senators, and especially if you live in a state that maybe your senator is already on board with you. But I still think it's important for you to call your senator and tell them that you're on board with them. But also, talk to your family and friends. Talk to your family and friends in states that the senators don't support. That are actually supporting Kavanaugh. So I think that there are things that you can do in your own private circles, like talk to your family and friends and speak out. I think one of the things that we've been talking as our three groups is, we often feel like communities of color and women of color are not talked about in the SCOTUS conversation, and yet the decisions so deeply impact our communities. And it's so important that we speak up and talk about the impact that this appointment could have on our communities. And that's why we think it's so vital for women of color to just speak up. We are doing a Reproductive Justice Day of Action on Thursday, and we are, I think we have over 100 women, mostly women of color, coming out to DC. And I think it's because, women of color do care, and they want their voices to be heard. And very often we feel like everything is happening around us and we don't have control. But I encourage everyone to just speak out and, use the influence that you have to voice your concerns and not feel disempowered. So that's what I would say to folks out there.
The last thing I'll say is, Jane mentioned earlier, it's not just the Supreme Court, it's lower courts as well. Don't forget to go vote. Yes. in November, and always midterm elections matter. All elections matter. And the most powerful way that we can make our voice, or one of the most powerful ways that we can make our voices heard, is to go to the polls to make sure that we have proper representation who can take a stand on our behalf, not only in Congress, but locally and at the state level. So vote, vote, vote.
Well, I can't think of a better way to wrap this up. Call your senator and go vote. But I want to really thank you both so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge about the dangers of the Kavanaugh nomination. And just thank you both so much.
Thank you.
For having us.